A starving orphan, barely surviving on the dusty trails of Texas, stumbles upon a frail old man collapsing from hunger and exhaustion. With nothing but a piece of stale bread to his name, the boy makes a choice that will change his life forever. He shares his only meal with a stranger who can't even remember his own name. What this orphan doesn't know is that the man he just saved from death isn't just any wanderer. He's Samuel Garrett, the owner of the largest and most powerful ranch in all of Texas, a man worth more than most folks will see in 10 lifetimes. And when the truth finally comes to light, the boy who gave everything when he had nothing will discover that sometimes one act of kindness can rewrite your entire destiny. This is the story of how a forgotten soul found his way home, and how a starving orphan became the heir to an empire he never knew existed. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the town of Dusty Creek, turning the dirt roads into waves of shimmering heat. Jesse Cole wiped the sweat from his brow with a tattered sleeve, his thin frame casting barely a shadow as he walked along the wooden boardwalk. At 14 years old, he looked smaller than he should have been, his clothes hanging loose on his body, patched and repatched so many times the original fabric was hard to distinguish. His stomach growled, a sound he'd grown so used to it barely registered anymore. Hunger was a constant companion, as familiar as the worn-out boots on his feet or the frayed hat that shielded his face from the sun. He'd already done his morning rounds, sweeping out the general store for a handful of pennies and hauling water for old Mrs. Patterson in exchange for a biscuit that was more air than substance. Now he was headed to the Watering Hole Saloon, where Roy McLean, the gruff but not entirely heartless owner, let him sweep floors and empty spittoons in exchange for whatever scraps were left from the lunch crowd. It wasn't much, but it was survival. Jesse pushed through the saloon's swinging doors, immediately hit by the smell of tobacco smoke, whiskey, and the faint aroma of roasted meat that made his mouth water. A few cowboys sat scattered around the tables, nursing drinks and playing cards. Roy stood behind the bar, polishing a glass with a rag that had seen better days. "You're late, boy," Roy grunted without looking up. "Sorry, Mr. McLean. Mrs. Patterson needed help with. Don't care about excuses. Floors need sweeping, and the back room's a mess. Get to it." Jesse nodded quickly, grabbing the broom from the corner. He worked in silence, his movements practiced and efficient. Every now and then his eyes would drift toward the kitchen door, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever food might be left over. His sister Margaret had sent him out this morning with nothing but a crust of bread and a promise that things would get better soon, a promise she'd been making for as long as he could remember. Margaret did her best. She worked as a seamstress, taking in mending and alterations for the townspeople, but the pay was barely enough to keep the roof over their heads at the small shack they called home. Their parents had died 3 years ago, a fever that swept through the town and took dozens with it. Margaret, only 19 herself, had taken Jesse in and refused to let the orphanage separate them. But survival came at a cost, and that cost was written in the hollow of her cheeks and the dark circles under her eyes. By the time Jesse finished his work, the afternoon crowd had thinned. Roy emerged from the kitchen carrying a plate wrapped in cloth. "Here," he said, shoving it toward Jesse, "leftover stew and some cornbread. Don't expect this every day." Jesse's eyes widened. "Thank you, Mr. McLean." "I dash. Get on now before I change my mind." Jesse clutched the plate like it was made of gold, nodding gratefully before slipping out the back door. The alley behind the saloon was quiet, shaded from the brutal sun. He unwrapped the cloth carefully, his stomach twisting with anticipation. The stew was cold, the cornbread hard, but it was more food than he'd seen in days. He was about to take his first bite when he heard it, a low, rasping cough from the far end of the alley. Jesse froze, his eyes adjusting to the shadows. There, slumped against the wall near a stack of empty crates, was an old man. His clothes were caked with dust, his gray beard matted and unkempt. His hat had fallen beside him, revealing a shock of white hair, and a face so gaunt it looked like death itself had already started claiming him. The man's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and labored. Jesse looked down at the plate in his hands, then back at the old man, and in that moment, despite the gnawing ache in his own belly, he made a choice. Jesse stood frozen in the alley, the plate of food still warm in his hands. Every instinct told him to turn away, to eat what little he had and move on. He'd seen plenty of drifters and down-on-their-luck cowboys in Dusty Creek, men who'd lost everything to drink, gambling, or just plain bad fortune. Margaret always warned him to keep his distance, to focus on their own survival because they had nothing extra to give. But something about this old man was different. Maybe it was the way his chest rose and fell so weakly, like each breath might be his last. Maybe it was the deep lines etched into his weathered face, telling stories of a life that had once meant something. Or maybe it was just that Jesse knew exactly what it felt like to be invisible, forgotten, left to waste away while the world moved on without you. He took a step closer, his boots scraping softly against the dirt. "Mister?" His voice came out quieter than he intended. The old man didn't respond. His head lolled slightly to one side, lips cracked and dry. Jesse knelt down, setting the plate carefully on the ground beside him. Up close he could see just how bad things were. The man's clothes, though covered in trail dust, had once been fine. A quality shirt with pearl buttons, boots that were scuffed but well made. This wasn't just some drifter. This was someone who had fallen far. "Mister, can you hear me?" This time the man's eyelids fluttered. Slowly, painfully, his eyes opened, pale blue and clouded with confusion. He stared at Jesse like he was looking through fog, trying to place where he was or who this boy might be. "Water," the old man rasped, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. Jesse's heart sank. He didn't have any water. He glanced around the alley, then back toward the saloon. Roy would tan his hide if he went back inside asking for favors, but what choice did he have? "Hold on," Jesse said quickly. Just hold on." He darted back through the rear door of the saloon, moving fast before Roy could spot him. There was a water bucket near the bar, kept for washing glasses. Jesse grabbed a tin cup, filled it hastily, and slipped back out before anyone noticed. When he returned, the old man's eyes had closed again. Jesse crouched beside him, lifting the cup to his lips. "Here, drink." The man's eyes opened once more, this time focusing a little better. He reached up with trembling hands, gripping the cup as Jesse helped him tilt it. He drank slowly, water dribbling down his beard, but after a few sips, some color began to return to his face. "Thank you," the man whispered, his voice still weak but steadier now. Jesse nodded, watching as the old man's gaze drifted to the plate of food sitting nearby. His eyes lingered there, hunger and shame mixing in equal measure. Jesse's stomach twisted. He'd been so looking forward to that meal, had been counting on it to get him through the rest of the day. But now, looking at this man who seemed moments away from death, the choice became crystal clear. He picked up the plate and held it out. "You need this more than I do." The old man stared at the food, then at Jesse, confusion flickering across his weathered features. "Boy, you're skin and bones yourself." "I'll be fine," Jesse lied, forcing a small smile. "Got another meal coming later." It wasn't true, but it didn't matter. The old man hesitated for only a moment before taking the plate with shaking hands. He ate slowly, carefully, as if each bite was something sacred. Jesse watched in silence, his own hunger gnawing at him, but something else, something warmer, settling in his chest. When the man finally finished, he looked up at Jesse with eyes that seemed clearer now, more present. "What's your name, son?" "Jesse Cole." The old man nodded slowly, as if committing it to memory. "Jesse Cole," he repeated, then his brow furrowed, and a shadow of confusion passed over his face. I wish I could tell you mine. Jesse frowned, tilting his head. You don't know your name? The old man's hand rose slowly to his temple, fingers pressing against a faded scar that ran just above his left eyebrow. His expression twisted with frustration, like he was reaching for something just beyond his grasp. There was an accident, he said quietly, his voice distant. I remember falling, hitting my head. After that, everything's scattered, like pieces of a puzzle that don't fit together anymore. He looked down at his dirt-covered hands. Some days I remember bits and pieces. Other days it's like I'm walking through fog. Jesse's chest tightened. He'd heard stories about men who got kicked by horses or thrown from wagons, waking up different, confused, lost, but he'd never met anyone like that before. You got family? Somewhere you're supposed to be? The old man's jaw clenched, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or longing, but then it faded, replaced by that same foggy uncertainty. I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been wandering for, I don't know how long, weeks, maybe months. Every town looks the same. Every face is a stranger. Jesse glanced toward the mouth of the alley, where the late afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows across Dusty Creek's main street. He should head home. Margaret would be worried if he stayed out too late, and she'd have questions about why he came back without eating. But as he looked back at the old man, frail, alone, with nowhere to go, he couldn't bring himself to just walk away. Come with me, Jesse said suddenly. The old man blinked. What? My sister and I, we got a place. It ain't much, but it's better than sleeping in an alley. Jesse stood up, brushing the dust from his knees. You can stay the night. Get some rest. The man stared at him like he'd just spoken a foreign language. Boy, you already gave me your food. You can't stay here, Jesse interrupted more firmly this time. Sun's going down soon, and it gets cold at night. Besides, he hesitated, then added quietly, nobody should have to be alone like that. For a long moment, the old man just looked at him. Then slowly, he nodded. Jesse helped him to his feet. The man was taller than he'd appeared while slumped against the wall, but his legs were unsteady, and he leaned heavily on Jesse's shoulder as they made their way out of the alley. They walked slowly through the dusty streets, drawing a few curious glances from townspeople, but no one stopped them. The coal shack sat at the edge of town, a small, weathered structure with a crooked porch and a roof that leaked when it rained. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a space barely big enough to call a kitchen, but it was home. Margaret was outside hanging laundry when they approached. She turned at the sound of footsteps, her eyes widening when she saw Jesse supporting the old stranger. Jesse, what? She dropped the shirt she'd been holding and hurried over. Who is this? Found him in the alley behind the saloon, Jesse explained quickly. He's sick, Maggie. Needs a place to rest. Margaret's gaze swept over the old man, taking in his ragged condition, the confusion in his eyes. Jesse could see the conflict on her face, the instinct to help warring with the reality of their own situation. They barely had enough for themselves. But then her expression softened, the way it always did when she looked at Jesse. She sighed, shaking her head. All right, she said quietly. Bring him inside. Jesse felt relief wash over him as they guided the old man through the door. Margaret cleared a space on the old cot in the corner, laying out a thin blanket. What's your name, sir? She asked gently. The old man lowered himself onto the cot with a weary groan. I'm not sure, but your brother here, he called me something earlier. He looked at Jesse. What was it? Jesse hadn't called him anything, but looking at the lost expression on the man's face, he said the first thing that came to mind. Sam, I think your name might be Sam. The old man, Sam, nodded slowly, as if testing the name. Sam, he repeated. Yes, that sounds right. Sam stayed. What was supposed to be one night turned into 2, then 3, then a week. Margaret never asked him to leave, and Jesse never suggested it. There was something about having him there that made the tiny shack feel less empty, less desperate. Sam didn't eat much. He insisted on taking the smallest portions, always making sure Jessie and Margaret ate first, and he tried to make himself useful in whatever small ways he could. On the fourth morning, Jessie woke to find Sam already outside, awkwardly attempting to mend a broken section of the porch railing with tools he'd found in the shed. His hands shook with the effort, but there was determination in his eyes. "You don't have to do that," Jessie said, stepping out into the cool dawn air. Sam looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "You and your sister took me in. Least I can do is try to earn my keep." He paused, studying the hammer in his hand with a strange expression. "Funny thing is, my hands seem to remember how to do this, even if my mind doesn't." Jessie noticed it more and more as the days passed. These odd moments where Sam's body seemed to remember things his mind had forgotten. The way he automatically checked the weather by looking at the clouds. How he knew exactly how to calm a spooked horse when they passed the livery. The careful, practiced way he handled tools, like a man who'd spent a lifetime working with his hands. One afternoon, Jessie convinced Roy McLean to let Sam help out at the saloon. Roy had been skeptical at first, eyeing the old man with the same suspicion he gave everyone. "He forgets things," Jessie explained carefully, "but he's a hard worker. Just give him simple tasks." Roy grumbled but agreed, and soon Sam was sweeping floors, wiping down tables, and hauling trash just like Jessie did. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, and Jessie found himself grateful for the company. It was during one of these shifts that something strange happened. A weathered rancher named Bill Hutchins walked into the saloon, his spurs jingling with each step. He ordered whiskey and sat at the bar, and when Sam came to wipe down the counter nearby, Hutchins froze mid-drink. His eyes narrowed, studying Sam's face with intense scrutiny. "I know you," Hutchins said slowly. Sam looked up, confusion flickering across his features. I don't think so, sir." "No, I do. I've seen you before." Hutchins leaned forward, his voice dropping. What was the name?" He snapped his fingers, frustrated. "There was a big spread outside San Marcos County. You were at a cattle auction about 6-7 months back. I'm sure of it." Sam's hand tightened on the rag he was holding. For a moment, something flashed in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or the ghost of a memory trying to surface. His breathing quickened, and Jessie could see the strain on his face as he tried to grasp onto whatever thread Hutchins had pulled. "San Marcos," Sam whispered, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. I can't." Hutchins watched him for another long moment, then shook his head and turned back to his drink. "Must be mistaken. Sorry, old-timer." But Jessie saw it. He saw the way Sam's hands trembled as he walked away, the way he pressed his palm against his temple, that same gesture he made whenever he was trying to remember. Something about what Hutchins said had struck a chord. That evening, as they walked home together, Sam was quieter than usual. "You ever heard of San Marcos County?" he asked suddenly. Jessie shrugged. "Sure, it's a few days' ride south of here. Big ranching territory. Some of the wealthiest spreads in Texas are down that way." He glanced at Sam. "Why?" Sam shook his head slowly, his expression distant. "I don't know, but when that man said it felt like something, like I should know it." He looked down at his worn hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. "What if I had a life there? What if someone's looking for me?" Jessie's chest tightened. He hadn't let himself think about that possibility, that Sam belonged somewhere else, with someone else. "Maybe," Jessie said quietly, "but until you remember, you've got a place with us." Sam smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. 2 weeks had passed since Sam arrived, and life had settled into a rhythm. Jessie had almost stopped wondering where the old man had come from, content with the companionship and the extra help around the shack. But everything changed on a windy Thursday afternoon when Jesse was taking out the trash behind the saloon. The wind had picked up, swirling dust devils down the alley and scattering loose papers across the ground. Jesse dumped the refuse into the bin and turned to head back inside when something caught his eye. A piece of paper plastered against the saloon's back wall, flapping in the breeze. He moved closer, squinting at it. It was a poster, weathered and faded by sun and rain, but still legible. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Missing." Below that was a photograph, grainy but clear enough. Jesse's breath caught in his throat. It was Sam, or at least it looked like Sam. The man in the photograph was cleaner, healthier, his beard neatly trimmed and his eyes sharp with clarity. But the face was unmistakable. The same strong jawline, the same scar above the left eyebrow, the same deep-set eyes. Jesse's hands trembled as he peeled the poster from the wall, reading the text beneath the photograph. Missing, Samuel Garrett. Last seen near the Brazos River crossing 3 months ago. Owns the Silver G Ranch, San Marcos County. Reward offered for information leading to his safe return. Contact Thomas Garrett or Sheriff Morrison in San Marcos. Jesse read it twice, then 3 times, his mind racing. Samuel Garrett. The Silver G Ranch. He'd heard of it. Everyone in Texas had heard of it. It was legendary, one of the largest and most successful cattle operations in the state. Thousands of head of cattle, sprawling grazing lands that stretched as far as the eye could see, wealth beyond imagining. And Sam, the frail, confused old man who'd been sleeping on their cot and sweeping floors at the saloon, was the owner. Jesse's legs felt weak. He slumped against the wall, staring at the poster in disbelief. All this time, they'd been harboring one of the richest men in Texas, and nobody had known, not even Sam himself. His first instinct was to run inside and show Roy, to tell everyone, but something stopped him. This wasn't about the reward. This was about Sam, about getting him home to the people who were looking for him, the people who must have been desperate to find him. Jesse folded the poster carefully and shoved it into his pocket. His heart pounded as he pushed back through the saloon's rear door, his eyes immediately searching for Sam. The old man was at a corner table, carefully stacking clean glasses. He looked up when Jesse approached, a faint smile crossing his weathered face. "Finished already?" Sam asked. Jesse swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "Sam, I need to show you something." Something in Jesse's tone made Sam straighten, concern flickering in his eyes. "What is it, boy?" Jesse pulled out the poster with shaking hands and placed it on the table between them. For a long moment, Sam just stared at it. His eyes traced over the photograph, the words, the name printed in bold letters. His breathing grew shallow, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Samuel Garrett," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Then something happened. Jesse watched as Sam's entire body went rigid, his eyes widening with sudden, overwhelming clarity. It was like watching fog lift from a valley, slow at first, then all at once. "The Silver G," Sam breathed, his hand rising to cover his mouth. I remember. Thomas, my son. The river crossing, I fell. My horse spooked, and I—" His voice broke, his eyes glistening with tears. "Oh God, I remember." Jesse felt his own throat tighten. "Sam, Mr. Garrett, you have a family. They've been looking for you." Sam's gaze snapped to Jesse, raw emotion flooding his face. Relief, joy, anguish all mixed together. His hands trembled violently as he reached for the poster again, clutching it like a lifeline. "I have to go home," Sam said, his voice choked with urgency. "Jesse, I have to. How far is San Marcos County?" 3 days' ride, maybe 4 on foot." Sam pushed himself up from the table, suddenly energized despite his frailty. "Then we leave now. Please, Jesse, help me get home." Jesse didn't hesitate. "Let me tell Roy. Then we'll go." They didn't have horses, and the stagecoach fare was more than Jesse had seen in his entire life. but Sam's desperation was palpable. He paced outside the shack while Jessie explained everything to Margaret, showing her the poster with trembling hands. Her eyes went wide, her hand flying to her mouth. "The Silver G Ranch? Jessie, that's—" "I know," Jessie said quickly. "Maggie, I have to take him. He needs to get home." Margaret looked torn, glancing between her brother and the old man pacing anxiously in the yard. Finally, she nodded and pressed what little money they had into Jessie's palm. "It's not enough for the stage, but maybe you can get passage on a freight wagon heading south." It took most of the day, but Jessie managed to convince a freighter named Dutch Carson to let them ride in the back of his supply wagon in exchange for the few coins Margaret had given them. Sam barely spoke during the journey, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his hands gripping the poster like it might disappear if he let go. They traveled for 3 long days. Sam's memory seemed to sharpen with each mile closer to San Marcos County. He began remembering details, the layout of his ranch, the names of his ranch hands, the way his son Thomas always took his coffee black. The memories tumbled out in fragments, pieces of a life slowly reassembling themselves. When they finally reached the outskirts of San Marcos territory, Sam sat up straighter, his eyes scanning the landscape with growing recognition. "That ridge," he said, pointing with a shaking finger. "Beyond that ridge is my land." Jessie felt his stomach knot with a strange mixture of emotions, happiness for Sam, but also something else. An awareness that once they crossed that ridge, everything would change. The Silver G Ranch appeared like something out of a dream. Jessie had never seen anything like it. The main house stood 3 stories tall, painted white with a wraparound porch and columns that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Barns and outbuildings stretched across the property, and in the distance thousands of cattle dotted the rolling hills. Ranch hands moved about their work, and the whole place hummed with purposeful activity. Dutch's wagon rolled to a stop near the main house, and Sam climbed down with more energy than Jessie had seen from him in weeks. His legs were unsteady, but his eyes were clear, focused. A man emerged from the house, tall, broad-shouldered, maybe 30 years old, dressed in fine clothes that marked him as someone important. He was speaking to a ranch hand, gesturing toward the western pastures, when his gaze drifted toward the wagon. He froze. The papers in his hand fluttered to the ground. "Dad?" The word came out strangled, disbelieving. Sam's face crumpled. "Thomas." Thomas Garrett ran. He crossed the distance between them in seconds, his boots kicking up dust, and then he was there, catching his father as Sam's legs finally gave out. They went down together, Thomas supporting his father's weight, both of them shaking with sobs. "I thought you were dead," Thomas choked out, his voice breaking. 3 months, Dad. 3 months of searching every trail, every town." "I'm sorry," Sam whispered, clinging to his son like a drowning man. "I couldn't remember. I couldn't find my way home." Jessie stood by the wagon, suddenly feeling like an intruder. This moment wasn't his. It belonged to a father and son who'd been torn apart and were now whole again. He took a step back, then another. Sam was home now. He had his family, his life, his empire. He didn't need a poor orphan boy anymore. Jessie turned and started walking back toward the road. "Wait." Sam's voice stopped him. Jessie looked back to see the old man pulling away from Thomas, his eyes red but blazing with clarity and purpose. "Jesse Cole," Sam said, his voice stronger than Jessie had ever heard it. "Don't you dare leave." Thomas helped his father stand, confusion written on his face. "Dad, this boy saved my life," Sam said, his gaze never leaving Jessie. "When I had nothing, when I didn't even know who I was, he gave me everything he had." His voice cracked with emotion. "He brought me home, Thomas. He brought me back to you." Thomas looked at Jessie properly for the first time, understanding dawning in his eyes. Jessie shifted uncomfortably under Thomas Garrett's intense gaze, his worn boots scuffing against the dirt. The ranch hands had stopped their work. All eyes now turned toward the scene unfolding at the main house. He felt small standing there, surrounded by wealth and prosperity he couldn't even begin to comprehend. "Sir, I did what anyone would have done," Jesse said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the distance. Sam shook his head firmly, wiping at his eyes. "No, son. Not anyone. Most people walked right past me. You stopped. You gave me your food when you were starving yourself. You brought me into your home when you had nothing to spare." Thomas stepped forward, extending his hand. "Jesse Cole, my father's alive because of you. That's a debt I can never fully repay." Jesse shook his hand, feeling the calluses there, the hand of a working man despite the fine clothes. Thomas's grip was strong, sincere, and when their eyes met, Jesse saw genuine gratitude. "I'm just glad he's home," Jesse said, and he meant it. "That's all that matters." Sam reached out and gripped Jesse's shoulder, his hand steadier now than it had been in weeks. "Come inside, stay for dinner, let us dash. "I can't," Jesse interrupted gently. He glanced toward the road, where Dutch Carson was already preparing to leave. "My sister's waiting for me back in Dusty Creek. She'll be worried sick if I'm gone too long." He could see the disappointment in Sam's face, but the old man nodded slowly, understanding. "Your sister, Margaret, she took me in too, didn't she? Fed me from her own table when she could barely feed herself." "She did what was right," Jesse said simply. Thomas pulled a leather pouch from his belt, the coins inside clinking heavily. "Then at least take this. For your trouble for the journey." "No, sir." Jesse held up his hand, taking a step back. "I didn't do it for money. I did it because it was the right thing to do." For a moment, both Garrett men just stared at him, as if they'd never encountered someone who'd refuse payment for such a service. Then Sam smiled, a real, genuine smile that made him look years younger. "You're a good boy, Jesse Cole, better than most men I've known." Jesse felt his face flush. He nodded once, then turned and climbed back into Dutch's wagon. As they pulled away, he looked back one last time to see Sam and Thomas standing together, the father's hand on his son's shoulder, both of them watching him go. The journey back to Dusty Creek felt longer somehow. Jesse sat in the back of the wagon, watching the vast Garrett ranch disappear behind the ridge, and tried to process everything that had happened. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a nobody, a starving orphan doing odd jobs just to survive. Now he'd reunited one of Texas's wealthiest families. But nothing had really changed, had it? He was still the same Jesse Cole, heading back to the same tiny shack, the same empty belly, the same uncertain future. When Dutch dropped him off at the edge of town 2 days later, Jesse walked home slowly, his legs aching from the journey. The sun was setting, painting Dusty Creek in shades of orange and gold. Smoke rose from chimneys, and he could hear the distant sound of the saloon's piano playing. Margaret was waiting on the porch when he arrived, her sewing abandoned in her lap. She jumped up the moment she saw him, rushing down the steps. "Jesse!" "Thank God, I was so worried." She pulled him into a tight hug, then held him at arm's length, studying his face. "Is he home? Did you find his family?" Jesse nodded, exhaustion finally catching up with him. "He's home, Maggie. He's with his son now. The Silver G Ranch. You should have seen it. It's like nothing I've ever imagined." Margaret's eyes searched his face, reading something there he didn't know how to name. "And they thanked you?" "They tried to pay me. I said no." She smiled softly, pulling him close again. "Of course you did." She guided him toward the door. "Come on, I saved you some supper. It's not much, but—" "It's enough," Jesse said, and he meant it. That night, he lay in his familiar corner of the shack, staring at the ceiling. He thought about Sam, Samuel Garrett, sleeping in his own bed for the first time in months, surrounded by family and comfort. Jesse smiled and closed his eyes. It had been the right thing to do. 4 days passed, then 5. Jesse tried not to think about the Silver G Ranch, about the life Sam had returned to. He told himself it was enough that the old man was safe, that he'd been reunited with his son. That was the reward, knowing he'd done something good in a world that rarely offered such opportunities. But on the 6th day, everything changed. Jesse was outside the saloon, dumping a bucket of dirty water into the street, when he heard the sound of hoofbeats. Not the usual lazy clip-clop of a tired ranch horse, but the sharp, purposeful rhythm of fine horses moving with intention. He looked up and nearly dropped the bucket. 2 magnificent horses came to a stop in front of the saloon, their coats gleaming in the morning sun. And mounted on them were Sam and Thomas Garrett, both dressed in clothes that announced their status: fine leather vests, polished boots, hats that cost more than Jesse made in a year. But it was Sam who caught Jesse's attention. He looked transformed, clean-shaven, well-fed, his eyes clear and sharp. This was Samuel Garrett, ranch owner, not Sam the confused old man from the alley. "Jesse Cole," Sam's voice rang out, strong and commanding. Jesse stood frozen as both men dismounted. The street was already filling with curious onlookers, people emerging from shops and homes to see what was happening. Roy McLean stepped out of the saloon, his eyes going wide. Sam crossed the distance in long strides and pulled Jesse into a crushing embrace. When he pulled back, his hands gripped Jesse's shoulders firmly. "I told you not to disappear on me, boy." "Mr. Garrett, what are you doing here?" Thomas stepped forward, a leather folder tucked under his arm. "We came to settle accounts," he said, with a slight smile. "I told you I don't want money." "This isn't about money," Sam interrupted. "Well, not exactly." He gestured for Thomas to open the folder. "Jesse, you gave me everything when you had nothing. You brought me home to my son. Now it's our turn." Thomas pulled out a document, official-looking, with a wax seal at the bottom. "We've arranged a position for your sister at the ranch. Head seamstress, room and board included, steady salary, more than she could make in a year here in Dusty Creek." Margaret had appeared in the growing crowd, her hand flying to her mouth. "What?" Sam turned to her, his expression warm. "Miss Margaret, you opened your home to a stranger. You fed me from your own table when you could barely feed yourselves. The least I can do is make sure you never have to worry about that again." Thomas handed Jesse another document. "And for you, Jesse, we've arranged for your education. There's a school in San Marcos, one of the best in Texas. Full scholarship, everything paid for. After that, if you want it, there's a place for you at the Silver G, learning the business, working the ranch, whatever path you choose." Jesse's hands trembled as he held the papers, the words swimming before his eyes. I can't." Sam knelt down to Jesse's level, his eyes glistening. "You saved my life, son. You gave me back my family, my home, everything I'd lost. Let me give you a future. Let me give you both the chance you deserve." Margaret was crying now, her hands covering her face. Jesse looked at her, then back at Sam and Thomas, then at the papers in his hands that promised everything he'd never dared to dream about. "Why?" Jesse whispered. "Why would you do all this?" Sam smiled, and it was the same gentle smile he'd worn that first night in the alley. "Because 3 weeks ago, a starving boy looked at a broken old man and decided he was worth saving. Now it's my turn to show you what you're worth." He stood and extended his hand. "What do you say, Jesse Cole? Ready for a new life?" Jesse looked at Margaret, who was nodding through her tears, her face glowing with hope for the first time in years. He took Sam's hand. "Yes, sir. I'm ready." The crowd erupted in cheers, and as Jesse stood there surrounded by people he'd known his whole life, he realized that sometimes one act of kindness, one moment of compassion when it costs you everything, can change not just one life, but many. Sam pulled both Jesse and Margaret into an embrace, and for the first time since their parents died, Jesse felt something he'd almost forgotten. He felt like he had a family again,